The August sun beat down on the high plateau like a hammer on an anvil, and Samuel Bridger knew he had maybe 3 weeks before his family would start dying of thirst. Not the dramatic kind of death you read about in dime novels, where a man crawls across sand dunes with cracked lips. No, this would be slower, meaner. The kind where you watch your children's eyes go dull, where your wife stops speaking because her tongue has swollen, where you make decisions no father should ever have to make about who gets the last cup of brackish water from a barrel that's growing things no Christian should have to look at. It was 1847, and the Bridger family had claimed a homestead in what would one day be called the Nebraska Sand Hills, though back then it was just called that God-forsaken stretch between the Platte and the Niobrara. Beautiful country, if you liked your beauty, harsh and unforgiving. Rolling grasslands that went on forever, scattered with wildflowers in spring. But come summer, those hills turned to dust and desperation. The nearest creek was 7 miles east, and it ran dry by July. The Platte River, 23 miles south, was their lifeline, but 23 miles might as well have been 200 when you're hauling water in wooden barrels on a wagon with wheels that sink 6 inches into sand with every turn. Samuel had learned the hard way that water wasn't just about having it, it was about keeping it, about making it last, about storing liquid gold in a land that seemed determined to steal every drop back through evaporation, seepage, or the slow, insidious corruption that turned clear water into a soup of algae, bacteria, and things that moved when you held a cup up to the light. The thermometer nailed to the side of their sod house read 94 degrees, and it wasn't even noon. Inside the dugout, where they'd stored 6 barrels of water hauled from the Platte 3 weeks prior, the air was thick and close. Samuel lifted the lid on the first barrel and immediately wished he hadn't. The smell hit him like a fist, that distinctive reek of rot and decay. The water's surface was covered in a green film, and when he dipped his tin cup in, it came up cloudy with strings of something viscous clinging to the sides. His wife, Martha, stood in the doorway with their youngest, 2-year-old Rebecca, on her hip. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Her eyes said it all. They'd rationed. They'd been careful. They'd done everything the way the other homesteaders said to do it. And now, 3 weeks into summer with 4 months of heat still ahead, they were watching their water supply transform into poison. Samuel had done everything right, or so he thought. He'd followed the advice that had been passed down through generations of frontier families, the accumulated wisdom of settlers who'd been carving homesteads out of raw prairie since the 1820s. It was the standard method, the one every guidebook recommended, the one that made perfect sense if you didn't think too hard about it. You hauled your water in barrels, oak barrels preferably, tight coopered and waterproofed with pine tar. You filled them to the brim because everyone knew that airspace meant evaporation. You kept them in the coolest place available, which on a prairie homestead usually meant the dugout cellar or the north side of your sod house where the afternoon sun couldn't reach. You kept the lids on tight to keep out dust, insects, and curious children. And you prayed it would last until the next supply run or the next rain. Samuel had done all of it. He'd paid $3 for each of those oak barrels from a cooper in Omaha, money they could barely afford. He'd made the 2-day round trip to the Platte, camping overnight by the river, filling each barrel to the very top with water that ran clear and cold. He'd hauled them back over those miserable sandy trails, losing half a day when one wagon wheel cracked and had to be wrapped with wet rawhide to hold together. He'd stored them in the coolest corner of their dugout, where the earth walls stayed a constant 60 degrees, even when the world above baked. He'd sealed those lids with beeswax, the way his father had taught him, the way his father's father had done it, and it had worked for a while. For that first week, the water was perfect, cold, clean, tasting faintly of oak but sweet compared to the alkaline seep that bubbled up in their makeshift well. The second week, he'd noticed a slight change in taste, a flatness that made you want to drink it faster to get it down. By the third week, the smell had started, and now, at the end of the fourth week, what had been pure river water was something else entirely. It wasn't just his family. Every settler within 50 miles was fighting the same battle. The Carlsons, 6 miles north, had lost 2 barrels to what they called the Green Death, a bloom of algae so thick it looked like pea soup. The Hendersons had tried digging deeper for their well and hit only sulfur water that smelled like rotten eggs and gave everyone who drank it violent cramps. Old man Peterson, who'd been on the prairie since '39 and claimed to know every trick there was, had shown Samuel his storage method with a kind of grim pride. 8 barrels in a root cellar covered with wet burlap, with charcoal chunks dropped in each one to purify the water. 3 of those barrels were already spoiled, and the charcoal had done nothing except settle to the bottom in a black, useless sediment. The problem wasn't laziness or ignorance. These were capable people, survivors, the kind of men and women who could build a house from sod bricks, deliver a breech baby with nothing but steady hands and prayer, or navigate by stars across hundreds of miles of trackless prairie. They knew how to preserve food, cure meat, store grain, make everything last. But water? Water was proving to be the one thing that wouldn't cooperate, the one resource that slipped through their fingers no matter what they did. The conventional wisdom had a kind of logic to it. Keep water cool, keep it sealed, keep it still. Don't agitate it, don't expose it to air, don't let the sun touch it. Treat it like you'd treat milk or beer or any other liquid you wanted to preserve, and for short periods, a few days or maybe a week, it worked well enough. But the frontier wasn't about days or weeks. It was about seasons. It was about surviving the brutal gap between spring rains and fall storms, about making it through months when the temperature stayed above 90 and the wind blew so dry it could pull moisture from a stone. Samuel stood in that dugout, staring at 6 barrels of water that were slowly becoming toxic, and felt the weight of his failure. He'd been so sure, so careful. He'd followed every rule, done everything the right way, and it hadn't mattered. The water was dying anyway, and soon his family would follow. But it wasn't just the spoiled water that made his gut clench with fear. It was the mathematics of survival, the cold calculation that every homesteader had to make. A person needed about a gallon of water a day in moderate weather, more in summer heat. His family of 5 needed 5 gallons a day, minimum. That was 35 gallons a week, 140 gallons a month. Each barrel held 40 gallons, so 6 barrels gave him 240 gallons total. In theory, enough for a month and a half if they were careful. But theory and reality were 2 different animals on the high plains. You didn't just drink water. You cooked with it, you washed with it, sparingly. But you did wash, because filth brought disease and disease brought death. Martha needed water for the washing, for the cooking, for the garden she was trying desperately to keep alive with cupfuls doled out to each precious tomato plant. The milk cow needed water, and if the cow died, they lost not just milk, but butter, cheese, and the cash they got from selling dairy to other homesteaders. And then there was waste, the water that sloshed out when you poured, the water that evaporated from cooking pots, the water that soaked into the ground when you dumped out a wash basin, the water that went to washing wounds because infection was always waiting, always ready to turn a cut finger into a death sentence. The margin of error was so thin you could see through it. Samuel did the math in his head, the grim arithmetic that kept him awake at night. Even if they cut back to absolute minimum usage, even if they let themselves go unwashed, even if they let the garden die and risked the cow, they were burning through water at a rate that meant they'd run completely dry by early September. And September, on the high plains, could be as hot as July, could be as dry as August, could be the month that broke you after you'd survived everything else. But there was another problem, one that was almost worse than simply running out. The water that remained was becoming dangerous, not just unpleasant, not just foul-tasting, but genuinely poisonous. Martha had insisted on boiling water for the children after she'd seen one of the Carlson kids come down with dysentery so severe the boy had nearly died. Boiling helped, killed whatever was swimming in those barrels, but it used fuel, and fuel on treeless prairie meant buffalo chips or the precious cottonwood they'd hauled from the Platte and were saving for winter. Every pot they boiled meant less warmth come January. And boiling didn't fix everything. It killed the living things in the water, but it didn't remove the taste, the smell, the visible particles of decay. The children gagged on it. Even Samuel, who'd drunk from mud puddles and stagnant ponds and once, during a desperate hunt, from a buffalo wallow that was more urine than water, found it hard to swallow. It was like drinking from a grave. The situation was creating a terrible kind of calculation in his mind. How long before the water was so bad that boiling wouldn't help? How long before they had to choose between drinking poison and dying of thirst? And more terrifying, how long before they had to make the decision to abandon the homestead entirely, to give up on 2 years of back-breaking work, to admit defeat and retreat to Omaha, or Council Bluffs, with nothing to show for it but calluses and failure? He wasn't alone in facing this crisis. The previous summer, 3 families had abandoned their claims and headed back east, and the story that circulated was that it wasn't Indian attacks or crop failure or loneliness that drove them away. It was water, or the lack of it, or, more precisely, the impossibility of keeping it. One of those families, the Morgans, had lost their 8-year-old daughter to what the circuit doctor called water fever, which was just a polite way of saying she'd died from drinking contaminated water that her parents had tried desperately to make safe. The frontier was littered with the graves of people who died not from dramatic causes, but from the slow accumulation of small failures. Not enough food, not enough medicine, not enough wood, not enough water. The prairie was generous in many ways, vast and rich with grass and game, but it was miserly with the one thing human life absolutely required. You could shoot a buffalo and feed your family for a month. You could burn prairie grass for warmth in a pinch. You could even eat roots and berries if you knew which ones wouldn't kill you. But water? There was no substitute for water, no clever alternative, no way to make do without it. Samuel had heard stories, whispered around campfires and trading posts, of entire wagon trains that had perished between rivers, of gold rush parties that had drunk their own urine and still died of thirst, of settlers who'd gone mad from dehydration and wandered into the prairie to die alone. Those stories had always seemed distant, cautionary tales about other people's mistakes. Now, staring at his barrels of spoiling water, he realized those stories were about people exactly like him, people who'd done everything right and failed anyway. The worst part was the shame. He'd promised Martha he could provide for the family, that he could make this work, that the land would yield to hard work and determination. He'd told his children stories about their future on this homestead, about the house they'd build when they saved enough money, about the herd of cattle they'd run on these grasslands, about the life they'd carve from this harsh but beautiful country. And now he was watching that future evaporate with every barrel of water that went bad. There was a moment, standing there in the dugout, with the smell of rot in his nostrils and fear in his gut, when Samuel Bridger thought about giving up, about loading the wagon, gathering his family, and heading back to Ohio, where rain fell regularly, and wells were easy to dig, and water was something you took for granted. It would have been the sensible thing to do, the safe thing, the thing that might keep his children alive. But Samuel had learned something about himself in his 2 years on the prairie. He was stubborn. Stubborn enough to plant crops in ground that people said was too sandy. Stubborn enough to build a house from dirt when everyone said you needed timber. Stubborn enough to stay when smarter people left. And that stubbornness, which was maybe just another word for foolishness, wouldn't let him quit. Not yet. Not without one more try at solving this impossible problem. He closed the lid on the fouled barrel and walked out into the blazing sunlight, squinting against the glare. Somewhere out there, in the vast accumulated knowledge of humanity, in the practices of people who'd lived in dry places, in the observations of men who'd spent lifetimes wrestling with the elements, there had to be an answer. Had to be a way to keep water good, to preserve it not for days or weeks, but for months, for a whole year, if necessary. He just had to find it. The answer began with failure, or more precisely, with close attention to failure, which was something Samuel had gotten good at. When you're fighting to survive on the edge of civilization, you can't afford to waste a mistake. Every failure is information, every disaster a lesson, if you're paying attention. It started 3 evenings later when Samuel was doing something he'd been avoiding, checking each barrel systematically, not just lifting the lid and recoiling from the smell, but really looking, studying, trying to understand what was happening. Martha thought he was torturing himself, and maybe he was, but there was something else going on too. A question forming in his mind. The first barrel, the one he'd checked before, was the worst. Green scum on top, cloudy water beneath. Smell like a swamp. But when he looked closer, he noticed something. The scum was thickest at the edges, where the water met the barrel staves, and thinnest in the center, almost like it was growing from the edges inward. The second barrel was better, only slightly cloudy, with just a faint film on top. The third and fourth were similar to the first, but the fifth barrel, when he opened it, was different. It smelled bad, yes, but the water was clearer than the others, and when he looked at the inside of the barrel, he saw something odd. The wood was covered in a slippery film, but the water itself had fewer particles floating in it. The sixth barrel was the most interesting. Samuel had filled this one last, had been in a hurry because a storm was coming, and he'd sloshed it around quite a bit while securing it in the wagon. Now opening it, he found that while it smelled stale, it was clearer than any of the others except the fifth. And there was something else. The sediment at the bottom was heavier, more settled, as if something had dropped out of the water and stayed down. He sat back on his heels, thinking. The conventional wisdom said you wanted water still, undisturbed, peaceful. But what if that was exactly wrong? What if still water was dead water, and dead water was where rot grew best? The next morning, Samuel rode 7 miles to visit Jacob Weiss, a German immigrant who'd staked a claim along Bone Creek. Jacob was known for 2 things: his thick accent that made every English sentence sound like a philosophical proclamation, and his insistence on doing everything differently from everyone else. The other settlers mostly avoided him, considering him odd, but Samuel had always found the man interesting, even if half of what he said sounded like nonsense. Jacob was working his small cornfield when Samuel arrived, chopping weeds with a hoe in the already brutal morning heat. He straightened when he saw Samuel, wiped his forehead with a rag, and grinned. "Herr Bridger, you come to see how the crazy German makes corn grow in hell, yeah?" Samuel dismounted and tied his horse to a fence post. "Actually, Jacob, I wanted to ask you about water. You've been here 4 years. How do you keep it?" Jacob's grin faded, replaced by something more serious. "Ah, water. The question everyone asks, but nobody listens to the answer." He gestured toward his dugout. "Come, I show you something." Inside Jacob's dugout, which was larger and more elaborate than Samuel's, there was something Samuel had never seen before, a shelf along one wall holding not barrels but clay crocks, 8 of them, each covered, not with a tight lid, but with a piece of cloth tied down with twine. "You keep your water in those?" Samuel asked, skeptical. The crocks were maybe 10 gallons each, far smaller than his 40-gallon barrels. "Yeah. And you know what? This water, some of it is 6 months old, from spring, and it is still good." He untied the cloth from one crock and dipped a cup in. The water was clear, with no visible film, no cloudy suspension. He handed it to Samuel. Samuel sniffed it cautiously. It smelled like nothing, like water. He took a sip. It was flat, tasteless in that way water gets when it's been sitting for a while, but it was clean, drinkable. He looked at Jakob in astonishment. How? I was not always a farmer, Herr Bridger. In the old country, in Bavaria, I worked on a ship. On rivers, ja, and I learned something about water. The sailors, they kept drinking water in casks, but they knew something important. The water, it must breathe. Breathe? Ja, breathe. The air must touch it, not too much or it evaporates, not too little or it dies. The cloth, it lets air through but keeps bugs out. And the crock, not the barrel, because the crock is like, how do you say, like skin. It breathes too, a little bit. Clay is not like wood. Samuel felt something click in his mind, but everyone says to seal it tight, to keep air out. Jacob shrugged. Everyone says many things. I watch what works. On the ship, the water in casks with loose covers, it lasted longer than the water in sealed casks. The sailors knew this. But here, nobody asks sailors about water. They ask other farmers who ask other farmers who all do the same wrong thing together. Samuel's mind was racing now. What else? Is it just the cloth and the clay? Jacob held up one finger. The cloth and the clay, Ja, but also small containers. You see? 8 crocks, not 2 barrels. If one goes bad, I lose only one. And the small ones, the water does not sit so long in one place. I use from this one, then that one. It moves. He held up a second finger. Also, I clean them. Every time I empty one, I scrub it with sand, rinse it with hot water, very hot. The slime, the green things, they grow on the sides of containers. You must kill them, or they make new water bad. A third finger. And I put stones in the bottom, clean stones from the creek. They make the water, he searched for the word, heavier at the bottom. The bad things settle on the stones, not floating. Samuel was barely breathing. Why don't you tell people this? Why doesn't everyone know? Jacob's face grew sad. I tell. At first, when I come here, I tell everyone. They laugh. They say, the German is crazy. He doesn't know American ways. They say, cloth will not keep water clean. You need tight seal. They say, why you make work with many small jars when you can have big barrels? He shrugged. After a while, I stopped telling. Let them learn or not learn is their choice. Samuel felt a surge of anger, not at Jacob, but at himself. How many hours had he spent in the settlement, talking with other homesteaders, sharing advice about crops and building and animals, and never once had anyone mentioned Jacob's method. How many times had he dismissed Jacob as just another eccentric foreigner who didn't understand how things were done here? But Jacob wasn't the only source of Samuel's revelation. 3 days later, he was hunting antelope on the northeast section of his land when he came across something that made him stop and stare. It was a teepee ring, stones arranged in a circle where Pawnee or perhaps Lakota had camped, maybe years ago, maybe decades. The prairie was dotted with these rings, ghosts of the people who'd lived here long before settlers arrived. Near the ring, Samuel found something else, a cache hole. A pit dug into the ground and lined with stones, probably used for storing food or supplies. And inside that hole, almost full of dirt and half buried, was a clay vessel. Not like Jacob's German crocks, but something else, something native, with design scratched into its surface and a shape that was rounded, almost egg-like. Samuel pulled it out carefully and turned it over in his hands. The clay was thick, porous, and when he looked inside, he saw watermarks, faint stains that showed this had been a water container. But what was it doing, buried in the ground? He sat there for a long moment, thinking. The Indians had lived on this land for centuries, maybe thousands of years. They'd survived every summer drought, every winter blizzard, every season of hardship that had killed settlers by the dozens. And they'd done it without supply wagons from Omaha, without trade goods from St. Louis, without any of the resources that civilized people thought they needed. They must have had ways of keeping water, must have had techniques, knowledge, methods passed down through generations. And those methods clearly weren't the same as the European practices that settlers brought with them. That night, Samuel asked Martha about the Pawnee woman, White Crow, who sometimes traded at the settlement. Martha knew her slightly, had traded vegetables for beadwork the previous fall. "Do you think she'd talk to me about water storage?" Samuel asked. Martha gave him a curious look. "You're really serious about this, aren't you?" "Martha, we're going to die if we don't solve this. If not this summer, then next. We need water we can trust, water that lasts." 2 weeks later, after sending word through a trader, Samuel met with White Crow at the settlement. She was an older woman, maybe 50, with silver-streaked hair and eyes that seemed to see right through pretense. Through the trader who spoke Pawnee, Samuel explained his problem. White Crow listened, asked a few questions, and then did something unexpected. She laughed. Not mockingly, but with genuine amusement. Through the translator, she said, "You white people, you take something simple and make it hard. Then you wonder why it doesn't work." She explained in bits and pieces filtered through translation and gesture how her people stored water, not in wooden barrels that rotted and leaked, not in sealed containers that turned water sour. They used clay pots, buried halfway in the ground where the earth kept them cool. They covered them with hide or woven grass, not tight lids. They added certain plants to the water, plants that kept it clean, though she wouldn't say which plants without further trade. They never stored water in one big container, but in many small ones. And most important, they moved the water regularly, poured it from one vessel to another, kept it active. "Water is like a river," she said through the translator. "When a river stops moving, it becomes a swamp. Same with water in a pot. Must move, must breathe, must touch the air and the earth. Your barrels, they are like dams. They kill the water." Samuel rode home with his head full of ideas, images, and possibilities. Jacob's European sailor knowledge and White Crow's Pawnee wisdom weren't identical, but they pointed in the same direction. They contradicted everything the homesteading guide said, everything the other settlers believed, everything that passed for common sense among white farmers, but they made sense. They made sense in a way that resonated with his observations of the barrels, with his memory of the one barrel that had been sloshed around and stayed clearer, with his instinct that something was deeply wrong with the standard method. The final piece of the puzzle came from Samuel's own childhood, a memory he hadn't thought about in years. He'd grown up in southern Ohio, and his grandfather had kept bees, not just for honey, but for the wax, which he sold to a candlemaker in town. Samuel remembered watching his grandfather filter honey, straining it through layers of cloth to remove bits of comb and bee parts and whatever else fell into it. And he remembered something else. His grandfather storing cider in clay jars in the root cellar, jars that had cloth covers, and that cider staying good for months, even years. His grandfather had been something of a naturalist, always observing, always experimenting. Samuel remembered him saying once, "The old ways aren't always the best ways, but they're usually based on something true. You just have to figure out what that something is." All these threads, Jacob's sailing knowledge, White Crow's native wisdom, his grandfather's practical experiments, his own observations, began to weave together in Samuel's mind. And slowly, over several days of thinking and planning and sketching in charcoal on pieces of scrap wood, a method began to emerge. Not a traditional method, not a method any other settler was using, but a method that made sense if you thought about water not as a dead thing to be sealed away, but as a living thing that needed care. It was crazy. It was the opposite of everything everyone said to do. It would make him look like a fool if it failed. But Samuel Bridger was done with conventional wisdom. Samuel spent the next 3 weeks becoming what the other settlers would eventually call that madman who talks to his water barrels. But before he could be mad, he had to be methodical. He had to build a system from scratch, and that meant acquiring materials, testing theories, and accepting that he might be wrong. Step 1. Abandon the oak barrels. This hurt, not just because they'd cost good money, but because they were substantial, solid, the kind of thing a man pointed to as evidence of prosperity. But Samuel had become convinced that wood was the problem. Wood was porous enough to let water seep and evaporate, but not porous enough to let air circulate properly. Wood grew slime and algae in its grain. Wood, for all its virtues, was wrong for long-term water storage. He needed clay vessels, but clay crocks were expensive, hard to come by on the frontier, and in any case, he needed something larger than Jacob's 10-gallon containers. He couldn't make dozens of trips to the Platte to fill small jars. He needed something between the impractical barrel and the tiny crock. The solution came from an unexpected source: Mexican traders passing through on their way to Fort Laramie. They had with them several large tinaja-style ollas, clay vessels used throughout the Spanish Southwest for water storage. These were massive 20-gallon capacity, with narrow necks and wide bodies. The trader wanted $10 for 3 of them, which was money Samuel didn't have. He traded his rifle, a percussion-cap Kentucky rifle he'd inherited from his father, along with a winter's worth of buffalo robes. Martha wept when he made the trade, not because she doubted him, but because that rifle had been his protection, his hunting tool, his inheritance. Trading it away was like trading away a piece of his identity. "I'll get another rifle," Samuel told her, though he had no idea how. "But I can't get another family if we die of thirst." With the 3 ollas secured, Samuel began the real work. He'd been thinking hard about White Crow's words about water needing to move, about Jacob's observation that water must breathe, and about his own grandfather's methods. What he'd come up with was a system that seemed absurd on its face, but logical if you thought it through. First, bury the ollas, not completely, but halfway, sunk into the floor of the dugout where the earth stayed cool and constant. The clay would draw heat away from the water through the same principle that made earthenware keep milk cold, and the ground would stabilize temperature, preventing the wild swings between scorching day and frigid night that the prairie threw at you. Second, no tight lids. Instead, Samuel cut pieces of linen from an old shirt, stretched them over the openings, and tied them down with cord. The fabric was tight enough to keep out insects and dust, but loose enough to let air pass through. He'd seen enough cheese-making and cider storing to know that some foods needed to breathe, needed contact with air to prevent spoilage. Why not water? Third, sand and stones. Samuel filled the bottom 6 inches of each olla with clean creek sand and smooth river stones, creating a filter bed. The idea, borrowed from watching water percolate through gravel, was that particles would settle out, would be trapped by the sand rather than floating in the water. Fourth, and this was the part that would make everyone think he'd lost his mind entirely, daily agitation. Every evening Samuel would remove the cloth cover and stir the water with a clean wooden paddle, making sure to agitate it thoroughly, bringing water from the bottom to the top, oxygenating it, keeping it moving. Once a week, he would actually pour water from one olla to another, a process that took effort but kept the water from becoming stagnant. But there was more. White Crow had mentioned plants, and though she wouldn't specify which ones without trade, Samuel started observing what grew near water sources. Near springs and seeps, he noticed certain plants seemed to thrive: wild mint, watercress, and a plant the Pawnee called waterclean that the settlers didn't have a name for. He took small cuttings of these, washed them carefully, and placed them in the ollas, just a handful in each. The plants would either keep the water clean or they'd rot and ruin everything, but he was willing to take that chance. The final element was inspired by something his grandfather had done with wine. Samuel boiled water, then let it cool to lukewarm before pouring it into the ollas. Boiling killed whatever was living in the water to start with, giving him a clean slate. Then the water could cool naturally in the ground-cooled clay, and the breathing system would keep it from going stagnant. When he finished setting up his system, Martha stood in the doorway of the dugout, looking at the 3 partially buried clay pots with their linen covers, at the stack of buckets for daily stirring and weekly pouring, at the sprigs of mint and watercress floating in the water, and she said quietly, "Samuel, people are going to think you've gone crazy." "Maybe I have," Samuel replied, "but crazy has to work better than what everyone else is doing." He made one more addition to his system, this one purely pragmatic. He kept one of his old oak barrels, filled it with water the traditional way, sealed it tight, and stored it next to the ollas. This would be his control, his proof. When people said his method was foolish, he'd show them the barrel water versus the olla water. Let the evidence speak. The news of Samuel's crazy water pots spread through the settlement faster than news of Indian sightings. Within a week, 3 neighbors had stopped by, ostensibly to borrow tools or ask about hunting, but really to see what the fool was doing. Old man Peterson was the most direct. He stood in the dugout, stared at the partially buried ollas with their cloth covers, and snorted. "You spent good money on Mexican pottery? You traded your daddy's rifle for water jugs?" "Ollas," Samuel corrected. "They're made for water storage. Been used in the Southwest for hundreds of years." "Southwest ain't here. Here you need proper barrels sealed tight. Otherwise you're just inviting every bug and bit of dust in creation to foul your water." He noticed the mint and watercress floating in one olla, and actually laughed. "And you're growing weeds in your drinking water?" "Son, you've lost your mind." Samuel kept his temper. "How's your water holding up, Mr. Peterson? The barrels in your root cellar?" Peterson's face darkened. "That's none of your business." "It's gone bad, hasn't it? All of it, or most of it, just like everyone else's. Summer's hard on water storage. Always has been. That's just the way of things." "Maybe it doesn't have to be," Samuel said quietly. Peterson left, shaking his head, and Samuel heard him telling another settler on his way out, "Mark my words, Bridger family'll be dead by winter, drinking water with weeds in it, storing it in buried pots like a savage. Man's gone native, lost his sense." But not everyone was dismissive. Jakob Weiss came by and spent a long time examining the system, asking questions, nodding slowly. "Yeah, this could work. Better than my Crocs, maybe, because the earth keeps it cool and the plants, they are smart. Very smart. But the stirring every day, that is much work." "Less work than dying of thirst," Samuel replied. "This is true. And the pouring, week to week? This is what I saw on the ship. Not the same, but the same idea. Keep water alive." He looked at Samuel with respect. "You might be genius or you might be fool. We will know in time." Martha's sister, who lived with the Henderson family, was more worried than scornful. She pulled Martha aside and whispered urgently, "Is Samuel all right? In his mind, I mean." Because this obsession with water, this strange system, it seems like he might be having a crisis. Martha, to her credit, defended him. "He's solving a problem everyone else is ignoring. That's not crazy, that's smart. But trading his rifle, Martha, that was his father's rifle. And these are his father's grandchildren. What good's a rifle if we're dead?" The worst was the Carlson boys, 2 teenage brothers who thought themselves clever. They started a rumor that Samuel was trying to brew whiskey in his dugout and was just using the water storage story as a cover. When Samuel heard this, he was angry enough to ride over and confront them, but Martha talked him down. "Let them talk," she said. "In a few months, when we have clean water and they don't, they'll be asking you for help. That's better revenge than any confrontation." Samuel knew she was right, but it still stung. He was trying to solve a problem that affected everyone, and he was being treated like a pariah, like someone who'd violated the unspoken rules of the settlement. The real test began in late August, when the heat reached its peak and the prairie turned to bronze and gold, beautiful and deadly. Samuel maintained his daily routine. Every evening, just before sunset, he'd stir each olla thoroughly, aerating the water, checking the smell, the clarity, the temperature. Once a week, on Sundays after church, he'd pour the water from one olla to another, a process that took half an hour, and left his arms aching. He kept careful notes on a piece of slate, marking down observations. Day 14, water clear, slight mint smell, cool to touch, control barrel already showing cloudiness. Day 21, water remains clear, plants healthy, control barrel has green film. Day 28, water excellent quality, control barrel unusable. By September, the difference was undeniable. The 3 ollas held water that was clear, cool, and drinkable, tasting slightly of mint, but otherwise pure. The control barrel, meanwhile, had become a swamp, unusable without boiling, and even then questionable. But September wasn't the test. October wasn't the test. The real test was whether the water would stay good through winter, through spring, through summer again. Whether it could last a full year, the promise implicit in what everyone was calling Bridger's crazy method. November came, and Samuel made his second trip to the Platte, this time borrowing a rifle from Jacob. He shot 2 buffalo, which would give them meat for the winter, and he filled the ollas again, starting fresh with the same method. Boiled water, cooled, strained through cloth, stored in the buried ollas with sand and stone filters, fresh mint and watercress, cloth covers. And every evening, the stirring, every week, the pouring. The original water from August, which he'd moved to smaller crocks to make room, was still good. 3 months old and still drinkable. Winter was hard, as winters always were on the prairie. Temperatures dropped below zero, the wind howled through cracks in the sod house, and they burned buffalo chips to stay warm. But in the dugout, the ollas remained at a constant temperature, the earth insulating them from the freeze, the water staying liquid and clean. When spring came, the August water was 8 months old. Samuel opened one of the crocks where he'd stored it and found it still clear, still drinkable, though flat-tasting. He shared a cup with Martha, and she cried, not from the taste, but from the relief. "It works," she whispered. "It actually works." But Samuel wasn't satisfied. 8 months was impressive, but it wasn't a year, and he'd made a promise to himself, a goal that seemed almost arbitrary, but had become symbolically important: to keep water good for a full year. Summer came again, 1848 now, and the test intensified. The heat was worse than the previous year, if that was possible. The thermometer hit 100 degrees for 6 straight days. Other homesteaders' water supplies failed even faster than before. People were making more frequent trips to the Platte, exhausting their horses and themselves in the brutal heat. But Samuel's water, stored in the buried ollas, covered with cloth, aerated daily, transferred weekly, filtered through sand and stone and kept clean by mint and watercress, remained good, remained drinkable, remained evidence that he hadn't been crazy after all. The change in attitude started slowly, then accelerated. First, Jakob Weiss adopted the method, building his own olla system and abandoning his crocks. Then Martha's sister asked quietly if Samuel could show her husband how to set up something similar. Then one of the Carlson boys, shamefaced, came asking for advice, admitting that their family was in trouble and needed help. Samuel helped them all. He showed them where to buy or trade for ollas, how to prepare the sand filters, which plants to use, how to stir and pour and maintain the system. He didn't lord his success over them or remind them of their mockery. He just helped, because that's what neighbors did, even neighbors who'd thought you were crazy. By July of 1848, 9 families in the settlement had adopted some version of Samuel's method. Not all of them followed it exactly, some cut corners or modified details, but the core principles spread: clay storage, partial burial, breathable covers, regular agitation, plant additions, filtering. The true test came on August 15, 1848, exactly 1 year after Samuel had set up his system. He gathered his family in the dugout, along with Jakob, Martha's sister, and her husband, and the Carlsons, who'd become reluctant but genuine friends. He opened the final crock of the original August 1847 water, the water he'd been saving for this exact moment. The water was clear. It smelled clean. When Samuel poured it into cups and everyone drank, it tasted fine, just flat and slightly mineral heavy, but completely safe. No one got sick. No one even felt queasy. 1 year. Water stored for 1 full year, drinkable and safe. The Carlson boy who'd started the whiskey rumor looked at Samuel and said, simply, "You did it. You crazy son of a bitch. You actually did it." Samuel grinned, feeling a year's worth of stress and doubt and fear finally lift. Crazy is just the first step toward genius. But the story didn't end with that one triumph. What Samuel had discovered, what he'd proven, was something bigger than just a water storage method. It was proof that the conventional wisdom could be wrong, that observing closely and thinking differently could solve problems that everyone else had accepted as unsolvable, that combining knowledge from different sources, European sailors and Pawnee wisdom and personal observation, could create something new and better. His method spread beyond the immediate settlement. Traders carried word of it west to Fort Laramie, south to Kansas Territory, east to Iowa. Other settlers adapted it, improved it, added their own innovations. Some used ceramic crocks instead of ollas. Some discovered that charcoal in the sand filter helped even more. Some found that certain other plants like yarrow or sage could substitute for mint. Within 5 years, variations of Bridger's method were being used across the Great Plains. A version appeared in a homesteading guide published in St. Louis in 1851, though it didn't mention Samuel by name. Another version showed up in a manual for frontier medicine, recommended by a doctor who'd treated far fewer cases of waterborne illness in areas where the method was used. But perhaps the most satisfying vindication came from an unexpected source. In the spring of 1850, a government surveyor passed through their settlement, documenting homesteads and survival strategies for a report to Congress about the viability of prairie settlement. He spent an afternoon with Samuel taking notes on the water storage method, asking detailed questions, examining the ollas. 3 months later, Samuel received a letter, forwarded through a trader, from the Office of Indian Affairs in Washington. It was formal, bureaucratic, but the core message was clear. They wanted to include his method in a manual they were preparing for Western settlers. They wanted to feature it as an example of how observing and learning from native practices could improve survival rates. Samuel never answered the letter, mostly because he didn't know how to address a reply to Washington and wasn't sure what to say anyway. But he kept it, folded in his Bible, as proof that what had started as a desperate experiment by a terrified father had become something larger, something that might help save lives he'd never meet. Years later, when Samuel was an old man and the Nebraska prairie had filled with settlers, when the settlement had become a town with a name and a church and a general store, people would sometimes ask him about those early days, about the water storage method that bore his name. He'd always tell them the same thing. "I wasn't clever, I was scared. Fear will make you pay attention like nothing else. And once I started paying attention, really looking at how things worked instead of just accepting what everyone said, the answer was obvious. Water's not a dead thing to be locked away. It's alive, and it needs care. Treat it right, and it'll take care of you." But what Samuel understood, what he'd learned in those desperate months of experimentation and doubt, went deeper than water storage. It was about something fundamental to survival on the frontier and to human progress generally. The old ways, the tried and true methods, were tried and true only until they weren't. Only until you encountered a situation where they failed catastrophically. The oak barrel water storage method worked fine in Pennsylvania, where it rained every week, and wells were easy to dig, and you never needed to keep water for more than a few days. But on the high plains, where water was scarce and distances were vast and summer heat could kill, That method was worse than useless. It was dangerous, a false comfort that lulled people into thinking they were safe when they were actually on the edge of disaster. The willingness to observe, to question, to combine knowledge from different sources, to look foolish in pursuit of truth, that was what made the difference between survival and death. Samuel had been lucky in some ways. He'd met Jacob Weiss, who had sailor's knowledge. He'd talked to White Crow, who had generational wisdom. He'd remembered his grandfather's experiments. But the real luck was in his willingness to listen, to synthesize, to try something new even when everyone said it was crazy. And that lesson, that openness to new ideas and different perspectives, became as much a part of the Bridger family legacy as the water storage method itself. Samuel taught his children to observe closely, to question assumptions, to respect knowledge, wherever it came from. When his son William grew up and moved further west to Colorado Territory, he took that lesson with him and applied it to crop rotation, developing methods that other farmers thought were insane, but that worked. When his daughter Margaret became a teacher in the growing town, she taught her students to experiment, to test ideas, to be willing to be wrong in pursuit of being right. The buried ollas in Samuel's dugout became something like a shrine in the settlement, a place people would bring visitors to show them. This is where Bridger figured out how to keep water good for a year. But the real monument wasn't the clay pots or the method itself. It was the idea that had driven their creation, the refusal to accept that a problem was unsolvable just because no one had solved it yet. In his later years, Samuel would sometimes sit in front of his house, which was no longer a dugout but a proper frame building with glass windows, and watch younger settlers arriving, setting up their claims, making the same mistakes he'd made. He'd help when asked, offer advice when appropriate. But he'd learned not to push too hard. Everyone had to come to their own realizations in their own time. But he'd always end his advice the same way. Pay attention to what works, not what people say should work. Observe closely, learn from anyone who has knowledge, whether it's a German sailor, a Pawnee grandmother, or your own memory of your grandfather's root cellar. The prairie will teach you if you're willing to learn. And never ever think that the way everyone's always done it is the only way to do it. The water storage method, in all its variations, persisted. It was adapted for wagon trains crossing to Oregon and California. It was modified for use in mining camps in the Rockies. It showed up in altered form in military manuals for frontier forts, always changing, always being improved, but always based on the core principle that Samuel had discovered through desperation and observation. Water must breathe, must move, must be treated as a living thing rather than a dead substance to be sealed away. And perhaps most importantly, the method became a symbol. When people on the frontier faced seemingly impossible problems, when conventional wisdom failed them, they'd remember Bridger's water ollas. They'd remember that one settler's crazy method had saved lives and proven the experts wrong, and they'd think, maybe I can do the same. Maybe my crazy idea isn't so crazy after all. That was Samuel Bridger's real gift to the frontier, not just a way to store water, but a way of thinking. The belief that careful observation, willingness to learn from unlikely sources, and the courage to try something different could solve problems that everyone else had accepted as unsolvable. The knowledge wasn't lost because Samuel didn't keep it secret. He shared it freely, taught it to anyone who'd listen, and encouraged others to experiment and improve upon it. He understood that survival knowledge was too valuable to hoard, that everyone's success made everyone safer, and that the frontier was harsh enough without people also having to fight ignorance and stubbornness. In the end, the story of Samuel Bridger's water storage method became one of those frontier legends that carried a truth deeper than the specific technique. It became a story about resilience, about innovation, about the power of observation, and the danger of accepting conventional wisdom without question. It became a reminder that the person everyone thinks is crazy might be the person who saves everyone's life. And it all started with one desperate father, staring at barrels of spoiled water, refusing to accept that his family had to die of thirst. That refusal, that stubborn determination to find a better way, made all the difference. Not just for the Bridgers, but for hundreds of families who came after, who benefited from knowledge that had been tested, proven, and freely shared. The buried Allahs in that dugout cellar with their cloth covers and their mint-scented water weren't just containers. They were proof that human ingenuity, combined with humility to learn from others and courage to try the untried, could overcome even the harshest conditions that nature threw at us. And that knowledge, that lesson, was worth more than all the clear water in the world.